The massive space station called Nexus Prime floated silently in the darkness between stars. For thousands of years, this place had been the heart of galactic civilization. Representatives from hundreds of different alien species had gathered, here to make important decisions, celebrate victories and solve problems together. But today felt different. Today felt like an ending. Ambassador Kyung-min stood near the huge windows overlooking the station's central chamber. He belonged to a peaceful race called the Etherians, beings of pure energy who had existed for millions of years. His glowing form flickered sadly as he watched the holographic screens floating around the room. Each screen showed terrible news. 17 more star systems had vanished completely in just the past month. Not destroyed, completely eaten as if they had never existed at all. The creatures responsible were called the Void Devourers. Nobody knew where they came from or what they really were. They looked like massive shadows with tentacles that stretched across entire solar systems. When they arrived at a star system, they would consume everything: planets, moons, asteroids, even the stars themselves. After they finished feeding, nothing remained except empty space. Not even dust. Elder Voth of the Zephyrite Collective stepped forward to address the gathering. The Zephyrite were ancient beings made of living crystal, who were famous throughout the galaxy for their incredible mathematical abilities. If anyone could find a solution to this crisis, it should have been them. But Elder Voth's crystal body, normally bright and colorful, now flickered with dull gray light. "My fellow beings," Elder Voth said, his voice echoing through the chamber, like wind chimes in a storm. "I have spent the last 100 cycles analyzing every piece of data we have about these creatures. The mathematics are clear and undeniable. At their current rate of consumption, our entire galaxy will be completely devoured within 50 standard cycles. 50 cycles. For most species, that meant about 50 years. It sounded like a long time, but for civilizations that had existed for millions of years, it was barely a moment. Gasps and cries of despair filled the chamber as the reality sank in. One by one, the great civilizations began to announce their decisions. The Centaurian Empire, proud warriors who had defended the galaxy for 10,000 years, declared they would retreat to their heavily fortified homeworld and spend their remaining time in isolation. The Star Wanderers, nomadic people who traveled between galaxies in massive city ships, announced they would flee to the distant Andromeda galaxy, hoping to escape the Devourers entirely. The Aquatic Federation, whose members lived in the oceans, of water worlds, decided to hide in the deepest parts of space where stars were rare. The Silicon Collective, beings made of living rock, chose to bury themselves in the cores of dead planets. Even the hive mind species, who had always believed in the strength of unity, voted to scatter across the galaxy and hope some of their colonies might survive. Ambassador Kyung-min watched this parade of surrender with growing sadness. These weren't cowardly species giving up easily. These were the greatest civilizations in galactic history, beings who had faced and overcome countless challenges over millions of years. They had survived wars, plagues, natural disasters, and the rise and fall of countless empires. But now, faced with creatures they couldn't understand or fight, they were admitting defeat. The final vote came quickly. The Galactic Defense Initiative, the organization that had protected the galaxy for thousands of years, was officially dissolved. Its fleets would be disbanded, its research stations abandoned, its personnel released to return to their home worlds. After 10,000 years of cooperation and shared purpose, the Great Alliance was ending, not with a bang, but with a whimper. As the session concluded and representatives began filing out of the chamber, Kyung-min remained at his post near the EEI windows. He could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. 10,000 years of civilization, countless generations of progress and achievement, all crumbling into dust. The galaxy had given up hope. 3 days had passed since the Great Galactic Alliance fell apart. Nexus Prime felt like a ghost town now. Most of the alien representatives had already left for their home worlds, taking their ships, their hope, and their dreams with them. The massive station that once buzzed with activity from hundreds of different species now echoed with emptiness. Only a few beings remained, mostly those who had nowhere else to go or were too stubborn to accept defeat. Ambassador Kyung-min was one of those who stayed. As an Etherian, he didn't really need to eat or sleep like other species, so he spent his time floating through the empty corridors, thinking about what the galaxy had lost. The silence was almost unbearable. For thousands of years, these halls had been filled with the sounds of different languages, the hum of translation devices, and the excitement of beings working together toward a common goal. Now there was only quiet. Suddenly, alarm bells started, ringing throughout the station. The sharp, piercing sound cut through the silence like a knife. Kyung-min's energy form brightened with surprise as he rushed toward the central command center. It had been days since any new ships had approached Nexus Prime. Who could possibly be coming here now? Station Commander Raxith was already at his post when Kyung-min arrived. Raxith belonged to a species called the Vormak, tough military beings, who looked like walking armor with multiple arms and glowing red eyes. He had been in charge of station security for over 20 years and had seen every type of ship and species imaginable. But now he was staring at his screens with confusion. "Single vessel approaching from the outer rim," Raxith reported, his gravelly voice filled with puzzlement. "Design unknown. Size is small, maybe 100 meters long. Technology level appears primitive, but they're maintaining perfect flight patterns." Kyung-min floated closer to look at the display screens. The approaching ship was indeed strange. It had a sleek, streamlined design that was somehow both elegant and simple. The hull appeared to be made of basic metal alloys, nothing fancy like the energy-based materials used by advanced civilizations. There were no visible weapon systems, no energy shields that he could detect, and the engine signatures suggested they were using simple fusion power rather than the quantum drives that most species had developed millions of years ago. No identification. Codes, Raxith continued, checking his instruments. Ship registry shows nothing. I've never seen this design before, and I've been doing this job for 2 decades. That's when the communication came through. The voice was clear and confident, speaking perfect galactic standard, without any accent or translation errors. This was surprising because Galactic Standard was a complex language that took most species years to master, and this voice sounded like someone who had been speaking it their entire life. "This is Captain Minho of the Terran vessel New Horizon," the voice said calmly. "We are requesting immediate audience with any remaining council representatives regarding the Void Devourer crisis. We have information that may be of critical importance to the survival of galactic civilization." Kyung-min felt something he hadn't experienced in months: curiosity. Terrans? He had never heard of this species before, and he knew about virtually every intelligent race in the galaxy. His people, the Etherians, were among the oldest species in existence, and they kept detailed records of every civilization they had encountered over millions of years. But Terrans wasn't in any of those records. Commander Raxth was less impressed. His multiple eyes rolled in annoyance as he prepared to activate the station's standard warning systems. "Impossible," he muttered under his breath. "Another primitive species wanting to play hero." Every few cycles, some newly discovered civilization shows up thinking they can solve problems that have stumped us for millennia. He started reaching for the communication controls to issue the standard warnings that were given to unauthorized vessels. Nexus Prime had strict protocols about who could dock and who couldn't. With the current crisis, security was supposed to be even tighter than usual. But something made Kyung-min hesitate. There was something different about this transmission, something in the tone of Captain Minho's voice that suggested confidence rather than desperation. Most primitive species who contacted the galactic community did so with fear, wonder, or pleading in their voices. They knew they were talking to beings far more advanced than themselves. But this Captain Minho sounded like he was talking to equals, like he had something valuable to offer, rather than just asking for help. "Wait," Kyung-min said, his energy form pulsing with sudden interest. "Grant them docking privileges." "Commander." Raxth's armored head turned toward him in surprise. "Are you serious? We don't know anything about these beings. They could be spies, terrorists, or just another group of primitives who will waste our time with impossible schemes." Kyung-min considered this for a moment. Then his form brightened with something that might have been hope. What do we have to lose, old friend? The galaxy has already given up. The great civilizations have all gone home to wait for the end. If these Terrans want to talk about the Void Devourers, what's the harm in listening? Maybe fresh eyes will see something we missed. The massive doors of the council chambers opened with a soft hiss, and 3 figures walked in. The chamber that had once held thousands of representatives from across the galaxy now felt eerily empty. Only about 20 beings remained, scattered across the vast space like lonely islands in an ocean of empty seats. The lighting had been dimmed to save power, creating long shadows that made the place feel more like a tomb than the heart of galactic civilization. Ambassador Jiwoo led the small human delegation into this almost empty hall. She was a woman, in her 40s with kind but determined eyes, wearing a simple dark blue uniform that looked incredibly plain compared to the elaborate robes and energy forms of the alien representatives. Behind her walked Captain Minho, a tall man with graying hair and the confident posture of someone who had spent years commanding spacecraft. Dr. Shung-ho brought up the rear, a younger man carrying several data tablets and looking around the chamber with obvious awe. The remaining delegates watched this small group with mixed feelings. Some, like Ambassador Kyung-min, felt curious about what these unknown beings might have to say. Others, like Commander Raxith, looked skeptical and annoyed, as if they were watching children trying to solve problems that had stumped the greatest minds in the galaxy. A few watched with the desperate hope of beings who had nothing left to lose. Jiwoo stopped in the center of the chamber and looked around at the scattered representatives. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong, carrying easily across the vast space without any need for amplification devices. "Honored representatives of the galactic community," she began, bowing slightly in a gesture of respect. "My name is Jiwoo, and I represent the people of Earth, also known as Terra. We are a young species barely 100 years into our spacefaring age. We know that compared to your ancient civilizations, we are like children trying to speak to wise elders." Several delegates shifted in their seats. This wasn't what they had expected. Most primitive species who contacted the galactic community either begged for help or boasted about their own importance. But these humans seemed to understand exactly how small and new they were. Jiwoo continued, "We have studied your records of the creatures you call Void Devourers. We have read every report, analyzed every encounter, and examined every piece of data you have collected over the past several cycles. And we believe we have found something that you may have overlooked." Dr. Shung-ho stepped forward and activated a device that projected a 3-dimensional map of the galaxy into the air above the chamber floor. Tiny dots of light showed the locations of Void Devourer attacks over the past 50 years. At first glance, the attacks seemed random, scattered across the galaxy without any clear pattern. "While your scientists focused on the incredible power of these creatures," Jiwoo said, gesturing toward the holographic display, "we focused on something else. We studied their behavior, and what we found surprised us." Dr. Shung-ho touched his tablet and the display changed. Now lines appeared connecting the dots, showing the movement patterns of individual Void Devourers over time. Suddenly, what had looked like random chaos began to show clear patterns. The creatures moved in long, sweeping arcs across the galaxy, following what looked like migration routes. "They follow predictable paths," Dr. Shung-ho explained, his voice filled with excitement. "Just like migrating animals on our home planet, they have feeding territories, seasonal patterns, and preferred hunting grounds. They're not some unstoppable cosmic force of destruction. They're wildlife. Very dangerous, very powerful wildlife, but wildlife nonetheless." The chamber erupted in murmurs of surprise and disbelief. Elder Voth, the ancient crystalline being from the Zephyrite Collective, leaned forward in his seat. His crystal form began to glow brighter as his interest grew. "Even if what you say is true," Elder Voth said, his wind chime voice filled with skepticism, "what does this matter? You propose containment? We have tried building barriers, energy fields, gravitational traps. Nothing can contain creatures of such immense power." Captain Minho stepped forward, a slight smile on his weathered face. "With respect, Elder Voth, we're not proposing containment. We're proposing something much simpler and much more practical. We call it Operation Shepherd." The holographic display changed again, showing a simulation of void devourer movement. But now, instead of consuming populated star systems, the creatures were being guided toward empty regions of space. Think of it like herding livestock, Minho explained. On our world, farmers don't try to cage their animals or fight them. They guide them. They use the animals' natural behaviors and instincts to move them where they want them to go. We can do the same with the void devourers. Jiwoo took over the explanation. We create artificial feeding zones in empty regions of space. We use dense matter, artificial stellar objects, anything that will attract their attention and satisfy their hunger. Meanwhile, we evacuate populated systems along their migration routes. We don't fight them. We don't try to stop them. We simply guide them away from populated areas and toward prepared feeding grounds. Ambassador Kyung-min found himself leaning forward, his energy form brightening with interest. There was something refreshing about these humans' approach. Where other species saw an impossible enemy, they saw a manageable problem. Where others saw hopeless despair, they saw an interesting challenge. You speak as if this is simple, rumbled Commander Raxth from his position near the back of the chamber. These creatures are larger than most space stations. They consume entire star systems. And you think you can guide them like farm animals? Captain Minho's smile widened. Commander, my species has a saying, the size of the problem doesn't matter. What matters is the size of your thinking. These creatures may be huge and powerful, but they're still following predictable patterns, and anything that follows patterns can be influenced. The weeks following the human presentation were unlike anything the galaxy had seen in centuries. While the official Galactic Council remained dissolved and most major civilizations had retreated to their homeworlds, something unexpected was happening in the shadows. Small groups of beings from different species were quietly reaching out to each other, sharing a dangerous new idea. Maybe, just maybe, these strange humans were onto something. The first species to make contact were the hive speakers, an insectoid race that communicated through a collective consciousness. Their home system was directly in the path of 3 approaching void devourers, giving them perhaps 6 months before complete annihilation. Queen Voice Zixith, speaking for billions of her kind, made a decision that shocked her own people. Instead of fleeing or preparing for death, she sent a secret message to the humans. The meeting took place on a neutral space station in the Outer Rim territories. Queen Voice Zixith arrived with a small escort, her chitinous exoskeleton gleaming. Under the station's artificial lights, she stood nearly 8 feet tall, with 4 arms and compound eyes that could see in multiple spectrums of light. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of her entire species. "Human Ambassador Jiwoo," she said, her mandibles clicking as she formed the unfamiliar words. "My people face extinction in 187 days. We have nothing left to lose. If your Operation Shepherd has even the smallest chance of success, we pledge our swarm's manufacturing capabilities to your cause." This was huge. The hive speakers were famous throughout the galaxy for their incredible ability to build things quickly and efficiently. Their factory worlds could produce more ships, equipment, and materials in a month than most civilizations could manage in a year. But they had never offered their services to anyone outside their own species before. Jiwoo accepted the alliance with gratitude, and within days, hive speaker factory ships were already beginning to construct the specialized equipment that Operation Shepherd would need. But the humans knew they needed more than just manufacturing capability. They needed military expertise, advanced technology, and most importantly, they needed other species to believe that the impossible could become possible. That's when Captain Tae-hyun arrived with the human fleet. 12 ships emerged from hyperspace near the meeting station, and at first glance, they looked almost laughably small compared to the massive battle cruisers that other species used. The largest human vessel was barely 300 meters long, while a typical Centaurian dreadnought was over 2 kilometers. Several alien military observers actually laughed when they saw the human ships on their sensors, but Captain Tae-hyun was ready for this reaction. A veteran of Earth's space exploration program, he had spent years developing tactics that relied on intelligence rather than brute force. When he began his tactical briefings, Even the most skeptical military minds found themselves paying attention. "Size doesn't win battles," Tae-hyun explained to a gathering of alien commanders. "Information wins battles. Our ships are small, but they're fast, adaptive, and equipped with the most advanced sensor arrays and analytical computers we could build." He showed them detailed behavioral analyses of Void Devourer movement patterns, predictive models that could forecast where the creatures would go next, and adaptive strategies that could change in real time based on new information. The alien commanders had never seen anything like it. They were used to military planning that relied on overwhelming firepower or impenetrable defenses. The human approach was completely different. They wanted to understand their enemy so well that they could predict and influence its behavior. Word of these meetings spread quietly through underground networks. The aquatic depth swimmers who lived in the deep oceans of water worlds throughout the galaxy had always been excellent at gathering information without being detected. They offered their advanced sensor networks to the growing alliance, providing early warning systems that could track Void Devourer movements across vast distances. The crystalline resonance, beings made of living crystal who communicated through harmonic frequencies, contributed their quantum communication systems. These allowed instant communication across galactic distances without the normal delays caused by the speed of light. This was crucial for coordinating operations across multiple star systems. Each species that joined brought something unique to the Alliance. The Silicon Collective provided advanced materials that could withstand extreme conditions. The energy. Dancers offered their expertise in manipulating gravitational fields. The deep thinkers contributed their computational abilities for complex calculations. What united them all was not their technology or their military power, but something much more powerful: hope. Yoon Seo, humanity's chief coordinator, established the Alliance's headquarters on a forgotten mining station called Outpost Kepler. The station had been abandoned decades ago when the mineral veins ran dry, but it was perfectly positioned in neutral space where representatives from different species could meet without political complications. As Yoon Seo addressed the first formal gathering of Alliance commanders, her words captured the spirit that was driving this impossible coalition. "We're not trying to match their power," she explained, looking around at the diverse group of beings who had gathered in the station's converted cargo bay. "Brute force didn't work for civilizations far more advanced than ours. But we're going to be smarter. We're going to use our minds instead of our weapons. And most importantly, we're going to work together in ways the galaxy has never seen before." The Alliance was growing, fueled by humanity's infectious belief that the word impossible was just another way of saying difficult. The galaxy might have given up, but these beings had found something worth fighting for. The Trillia system had always been one of the most peaceful places in the galaxy. 5 beautiful planets orbited a gentle yellow star, their surfaces covered with vast farms and gardens that fed dozens of other worlds. The Trillians themselves were a quiet, kind species who looked somewhat like tall, slender humans with pale green skin and large, gentle eyes. They had never fought a war, never built weapons of mass destruction, and never harmed anyone. They spent their days growing food, creating art, and raising their children in harmony with nature. Now 3 billion of these peaceful beings faced certain death. Long-range sensors had detected a Void Devourer approaching their system, and according to all calculations, it would arrive in just 2 weeks. The creature was massive, easily the size of a small moon, and it was following a direct path toward their sun. Once it arrived, it would consume their star, their planets, and every living thing in the system. The Trillian government had already begun evacuation procedures, but with only 2 weeks and limited transport ships, they could save maybe 10% of their population at best. The rest would die, and their beautiful agricultural worlds would become nothing but empty space. It was exactly the kind of tragedy that had been happening across the galaxy for months, the kind that had convinced most civilizations to give up hope entirely. But Admiral Dong-wook had a different plan. Standing on the bridge of his flagship, the human vessel Determination, he looked out at the strangest fleet ever assembled in galactic history. 12 human ships worked alongside hive-speaker factory vessels, depth swimmer sensor platforms, and resonant communication arrays. It wasn't much compared to the massive battle fleets that great empires used to command, but it represented something new: cooperation between species who had never worked together before. "All ships, this is Admiral Dong-wook," he broadcast across the fleet's communication network. His voice was calm but determined, carrying the weight of 3 billion lives. "Today we find out if Operation Shepherd actually works. Remember, we're not here to fight this creature. We're not trying to destroy it or drive it away. We're here to guide it, like a shepherd guiding sheep." The plan was incredibly complex and had never been attempted before. Over the past week, hive-speaker factory ships had been working around the clock to create artificial stellar matter, dense energy-rich materials that would hopefully attract the Void Devourer's attention. This artificial food had been carefully positioned in an empty region of space, about 50 light-years away from the Trillia system. Meanwhile, human psychological warfare specialists had spent months studying every recorded encounter with Void Devourers, looking for patterns in how the creatures responded to different stimuli. They had developed a theory that these beings, despite their immense power, followed predictable behavioral patterns similar to migrating animals on Earth. Commander Hai-Wan led the psychological warfare team from the bridge of the research vessel, Insight. She was a small, intense woman who had originally studied animal behavior before joining Earth's space program. Her team had identified specific types of energy pulses, gravitational disturbances, and electromagnetic signals that seemed to influence Void Devourer movement patterns. "Sensors show the target entering the outer edge of the system," reported Lieutenant Jin Ho from the sensor station. "Distance, 4 billion kilometers and closing. Current trajectory puts it on a direct collision course with the Trillia Sun in approximately 36 hours. This was it, the moment of truth. If their theory was wrong, if their calculations were off by even a small amount, 3 billion innocent beings would die, and the Alliance would be proven a failure before it had really begun. "Begin Phase 1, Admiral Dong-wook ordered. All ships move to predetermined positions. Remember, timing is everything." The fleet spread out across the system in a carefully planned formation. Human ships took point positions, using their advanced sensors to track the approaching Devourer's exact movements. Hive-speaker vessels positioned themselves near the artificial stellar matter they had created, ready to enhance its energy output if needed. Depth swimmer sensor platforms established a detection grid that would allow them to monitor the creature's behavior in real time. "Psychological warfare team, you are cleared to begin operations," the Admiral announced. Commander Hai-Wan took a deep breath and activated her equipment. "Beginning calculated provocations in 3, 2, 1, now." Her team began transmitting carefully designed energy pulses toward the approaching Void Devourer. These weren't attacks. They were more like gentle nudges, designed to make the creature slightly uncomfortable with its current path, and more interested in the alternative feeding zone they had prepared. At first, nothing seemed to happen. The massive creature continued its relentless approach toward the Trillia system, its shadowy tentacles reaching out ahead of it, like dark fingers of death. But then slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to change. "I'm reading a slight course correction," reported Lieutenant Jin Ho, his voice filled with excitement. "The target is deviating from its original trajectory by 0.03 degrees. It wasn't much, but it was a start." Over the next several hours, the psychological warfare team continued their careful work, applying gentle pressure here, attractive stimuli there, slowly encouraging the Void Devourer to change its path. It was like trying to steer a mountain, but somehow impossibly it was working. "Course deviation now at 2.7 degrees and increasing," Jin Ho reported. "If this continues, the target will miss the Trillia system entirely." But their celebration was premature. Suddenly the creature stopped changing course and began moving directly toward one of the outer planets where millions of trillions lived. "Emergency maneuvers!" Admiral Dong-wook shouted. "All ships, implement contingency plan Delta! 3 human!" Vessels, including the scout ship Courage, deliberately placed themselves between the Void Devourer and the populated planet. It was an incredibly dangerous move. They were essentially using themselves as bait to redirect the creature's attention toward the prepared feeding zone. The plan worked, but at a terrible cost. The Void Devourer's feeding tentacles lashed out, and the Courage was caught in the creature's grasp. The ship was consumed in seconds, taking its crew of 23 brave souls with it. 2 other vessels were damaged but managed to escape. But the sacrifice wasn't in vain. The creature, now fully focused on the energy-rich artificial stellar matter in the prepared feeding zone, finally changed course completely. Over the next 12 hours, it moved away from the populated system and began consuming the artificial food they had provided for it. When the Void Devourer finally settled into its new feeding ground, consuming the prepared stellar matter instead. Of the Trillia system, celebration erupted across the Allied fleet. They had done it. They had actually redirected one of these impossible creatures away from a populated system. The victory came at a cost. 3 ships lost, 23 brave crew members dead, and the Devourer had fed for longer than their models predicted. But for the first time in months, hope blazed across the galaxy like a new star. The impossible had become possible, and the galaxy had reason to believe in tomorrow again. The news traveled faster than any starship could fly. Within hours of the Trillia operation's success, communication networks across the galaxy were buzzing with something they hadn't carried in months: hope. The impossible had happened. A Void Devourer, one of those unstoppable cosmic nightmares that had been devouring entire star systems, had been redirected away from a populated world. 3 billion lives had been saved, not through superior firepower or ancient technology, but through clever thinking and cooperation. On the planet Zentara Prime, home to the ancient hierarchs who had ruled galactic politics for thousands of years, emergency sessions were called in the middle of the night. On the water world of Aquatica, the depth swimmer councils cancelled their isolation protocols for the first time in decades. Even on the distant crystal worlds of the Resonant Collective, harmonic frequencies carried the news at the speed of thought. The old Galactic Council chambers, which had been officially closed and abandoned just weeks ago, suddenly came alive again. Ships began arriving from across the galaxy, as representatives who had fled in despair now returned with burning questions. How had this small alliance of primitive humans and desperate allies accomplished what the greatest civilizations in galactic history had deemed impossible? But the renewed activity in the council chambers quickly turned into something ugly. The great civilizations that had given up and retreated to their home worlds now faced an uncomfortable truth. They had been wrong, and admitting they were wrong meant admitting they had abandoned billions of innocent beings to die when there might have been another way. Hierarch Prime Zul'Kan, the most senior of the ancient rulers, stood at the center of the restored chamber like a pillar of barely controlled rage. His species, the Vortaki, were tall, imposing beings with silver skin and glowing eyes, who had ruled parts of the galaxy since before most other species had even discovered fire. They were not accustomed to being shown up by newcomers. These operations are completely unauthorized and utterly reckless, Zul'Kan declared, his voice echoing through the chamber with the authority of 10,000 years of rule. These humans are dangerous amateurs playing with forces they don't understand. They will doom us all with their arrogance and their foolish experiments. Murmurs of agreement came from other conservative representatives. The eternal princes of the Stellar dynasty nodded their crystalline heads in approval. The high commanders of the Void Fleet crossed their multiple arms in gestures of support. These were beings who had ruled the galaxy for millennia, and they were not about to admit that a species barely a century into space travel had found solutions they had missed. But then something unexpected happened. Colonel Sunwoo of the mighty Centaurian Empire stood up from his seat. The Centaurians were legendary warriors, a proud military culture that had defended the galaxy's borders for over 10,000 years. When a Centaurian colonel spoke, people listened. Sunwoo was a veteran of countless battles, his blue-scaled skin marked with the ritual scars that showed his rank and experience. He had served the Empire faithfully for over 50 years, rising through the ranks to become one of their most respected military leaders. His loyalty to the Empire had never been questioned. Until now. Honored hierarchs, Sun Wu said, his voice carrying the strength of absolute conviction. I have served the Centaurian Empire my entire adult life. I have followed orders without question, defended our borders without hesitation, and accepted the wisdom of our leaders without doubt. But today I can no longer do so. The chamber fell silent. What was he saying? I hereby resign my commission. Effective immediately, Sun Wu continued, removing the insignia of rank from his uniform and placing them on the floor before him. I am joining the Human Alliance. They have accomplished what we deemed impossible. They have saved 3 billion lives while we sat in our comfortable palaces and declared defeat. The impact of his words was like a bomb going off in the chamber. A Centaurian colonel didn't just resign. It was almost unheard of in their culture. But Sun Wu wasn't finished. For months we have told ourselves that there was nothing we could do, he said, looking directly at Hierarch Prime Zulkan. We convinced ourselves that retreat was wisdom, that giving up was practical, but these humans have proven us wrong. They didn't accept defeat because they were too young and too foolish to know it was impossible, and because they didn't know it was impossible, they did it anyway. The silence that followed was deafening. Then slowly other beings began to stand. A Zephyrite scientist removed her research badges. A depth swimmer admiral pulled off his command insignia. An Etherian diplomat dissolved the energy bonds that marked her diplomatic status. What started as one defection quickly became an avalanche. Military officers who had spent their careers following orders from superiors who had now given up. Scientists who had been told to stop researching solutions that didn't exist. Diplomats who had been ordered to prepare for the end rather than search for alternatives. Within hours, the trickle became a flood. Ships began leaving major military bases not to flee, but to join the growing alliance. Research stations that had been shuttered were reactivated by scientists who refused to accept defeat. Communication networks that had been used to coordinate. Retreats were now being used to coordinate hope. Ambassador Young Jin, one of the human diplomatic team, found herself suddenly overwhelmed with requests from beings wanting to join Operation Shepherd. She had to quickly establish new protocols for handling the flood of volunteers, creating systems to organize the diverse species and their different capabilities. Dr. Mi Young, the human scientist who specialized in integrating different technologies, was working around the clock to figure out how to combine the advanced systems of dozens of different species into unified networks. Centaurian military hardware had to work alongside hive speaker manufacturing systems. Depth swimmer sensors needed to interface with resonant communication arrays. It was like trying to build a symphony orchestra where every musician played a different type of instrument and spoke a different language. But somehow it was working. The alliance that had started with just a few desperate species was now growing exponentially. Hundreds of ships became thousands. Dozens of species became scores. What had begun as a desperate gamble was becoming the largest cooperative effort in galactic history. The galaxy was choosing hope over resignation, and that choice was being led by a young species that had refused to accept that anything was truly impossible. The humans had shown them something they had forgotten, that sometimes the best solutions come not from the oldest and wisest, but from those who are too inexperienced to know that something can't be done. The message came through, the galaxy's emergency communication network, at exactly 0347 Galactic Standard Time, and it changed everything. Deep space monitoring stations had detected something that made every previous Void Devourer encounter look like a minor inconvenience. 7 of the massive creatures were moving toward the same destination, the galactic core itself. The galactic core wasn't just another star system. It was the ancient heart of civilization, home to the oldest space stations, the most important historical sites, and the central hub that connected every major trade route in the galaxy. More than that, it contained the Great Archive, a massive collection of knowledge from every species that had ever achieved spaceflight. If the core was destroyed, the galaxy wouldn't just lose billions of lives, it would lose its entire history, its culture, its very identity. Dr. Sheng Ho was the first to realize the full implications when he saw the tracking data. Working through the night in his small laboratory aboard the research station, he ran calculation after calculation, hoping his initial analysis was wrong. But the numbers didn't lie. 7 void devourers, each following different paths across the galaxy, were all converging on the same point. It wasn't a coincidence, it was a feeding frenzy. They're drawn to areas of high energy density, he explained to Admiral Dongwook during an emergency briefing. The galactic core has more stars, more civilizations, more energy sources packed together than anywhere else in the galaxy. To them, it must look like the ultimate buffet. Admiral Dongwook studied the tactical displays with growing concern. One void devourer had been challenging enough. 7 of them, all arriving at the same time, was beyond anything they had ever imagined facing. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. Even if they could redirect 6 of the creatures, the 7th would still be enough to destroy the core. How long do we have? He asked. Based on current trajectories, they'll all arrive within a 15-day window, Dr. Xiong Ho replied. The first one reaches the outer edge of the core region in 43 days. Chief Coordinator Yoon Seo immediately began pulling up logistics reports on her data tablets. Since the Trillia success, the alliance had grown exponentially. But coordinating 1,000 ships from 40 different species was like trying to conduct an orchestra where every musician played different music and spoke different languages. We have 1,073 ships confirmed operational, she reported. 42 species represented, but that includes everything from Centaurian battle cruisers to hive-speaker construction vessels to human scout ships. Getting them all to work together on something this complex. She paused, looking at the scope of what they were attempting. It's never been done before. The logistics alone could take months to organize, but they didn't have months. They had 6 weeks to plan and execute the most complex military operation in galactic history, or watch their entire civilization disappear forever. Ambassador Jiwoo called for an emergency assembly of all Alliance commanders. The meeting took place on the massive hive-speaker factory station that had become the Alliance's unofficial headquarters. Representatives from dozens of species gathered in the station's central chamber, a space that had been hastily converted from a manufacturing center into a command facility. Looking out at the assembled commanders, Centaurian warriors with their blue-scaled skin and ritual scars, Etherian energy beings glowing within a light, crystalline resonance humming with harmonic frequencies, insectoid hive speakers clicking their mandibles nervously. Jiwoo felt the weight of galactic civilization resting on their shoulders. "My friends," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the translation systems, "we face our greatest test. 7 void devourers are approaching the galactic core. If even one of them reaches its destination, we lose everything. Not just the billions of lives in the core systems, but our entire history, our culture, everything that makes us who we are as galactic civilization." The chamber was completely silent. Every being present understood what this meant. "But I want you to remember something," Jiwoo continued, her voice growing stronger. 6 weeks ago, the galaxy had given up. The greatest civilizations in history had declared defeat and retreated to their home worlds to wait for the end. Today, we have over 1,000 ships crewed by beings from 40 different species, all working together toward a common goal. We have already accomplished the impossible once. Today, we prove that cooperation can overcome any obstacle. Captain Tae-hyun stepped forward to begin the tactical briefing. His advanced scout teams had been working around the clock, using long-range sensors and predictive modeling to map the movement patterns of all 7 void devourers with unprecedented precision. The good news is that they're not coordinating with each other, he explained, activating a 3-dimensional display that showed the creatures' projected paths. They're following their individual migration patterns, which means they'll arrive at different times and from different directions. That gives us opportunities to deal with them separately. Dr. Xiong Ho's behavioral models had been refined based on data from the Trillia operation. His team had identified optimal placement locations for artificial feeding stations across 3 galactic sectors, massive constructions of dense matter and artificial stellar material that would hopefully attract the creatures away from populated systems. "The challenge is scale," Dr. Xiong Ho explained. "For the Trillia operation, we built feeding stations to attract 1 creature. For this, we need to build 7 different attractions, each one larger and more energy-dense than anything we've ever attempted. The Hive speakers had already begun construction, their factory ships working at maximum capacity to produce the specialized materials needed. But even with their incredible manufacturing abilities, creating 7 artificial feeding zones in just 6 weeks was pushing the limits of what was physically possible. As the massive operation began to take shape, every being in the galaxy became aware that their civilization's fate hung in the balance. Communication networks carried constant updates. News services provided around-the-clock coverage. On worlds throughout the galaxy, beings who had never met humans found themselves watching the progress of these strange newcomers who refused to accept defeat. The operation would require perfect timing, flawless coordination, and more luck than anyone wanted to admit. But for the first time in months, the galaxy had something it had almost forgotten: hope that tomorrow might actually come. Everything was going according to plan until it wasn't. For 18 hours, the massive operation had unfolded like a perfectly choreographed dance. 7 different task forces, each comprising ships from multiple species, had taken positions across 3 galactic sectors. The artificial feeding stations were in place, their dense matter and artificial stellar material pulsing with energy, designed to attract the approaching void devourers. Communication networks buzzed with constant updates as thousands of beings worked together with unprecedented coordination. Dr. Sheng Ho sat in his command center aboard the research vessel Insight, monitoring behavioral readings from all 7 approaching creatures. His predictive models had been refined to incredible accuracy, showing exactly when and where each devourer would arrive. Everything was proceeding exactly as calculated. Then, at 13:47 hours Galactic Standard Time, everything went wrong. "Sir, we have a problem," Lieutenant Junho reported from the sensor station, his voice tight with worry. "Devourers 4 and 5 are breaking from predicted trajectories. They're changing course toward the Meridian Cluster." Dr. Sung Ho felt his stomach drop. The Meridian Cluster was one of the most densely populated regions in the galaxy, home to over 50 billion beings across 12 different star systems. If even one void devourer reached the cluster, the death toll would be unimaginable. "That's impossible," he muttered, frantically checking his calculations. "The models show them continuing toward Feeding Station Delta. They should be following the energy gradient we created." But the sensors didn't lie. 2 of the massive creatures, each the size of a small moon, were deviating from their predicted paths and heading straight toward billions of innocent lives. Commander Hai Wan was coordinating fleet movements from her position aboard the command ship Determination. As reports flooded in about the course changes, she quickly realized the scope of the disaster they were facing. "Admiral, Task Forces 3 and 4 are completely out of position," she reported to Admiral Dong Wook. "We have ships scattered across 2 sectors, and the nearest vessels to the Meridian Cluster are at least 6 hours away at maximum speed." The communication networks, which had been handling the coordination of over 1,000 ships reasonably well, suddenly began breaking. Down under the strain, when you have 40 different species using different technologies, different protocols and different languages, even small problems can cascade into complete system failures. Centaurian battle cruisers couldn't establish secure connections with Hive speaker factory ships. Depth swimmer sensor platforms were sending data in formats that resonant communication arrays couldn't process. Human ships found themselves trying to coordinate with alien vessels whose crews spoke languages they'd never encountered before. "We're losing them," Commander Haywan reported, as panic began spreading through several alien contingents. Multiple ships are reporting communication failures. Some of the newer Alliance members are requesting permission to withdraw. That's when the real catastrophe began. Fear is contagious, especially among beings who are already operating far outside their comfort zones. Several Aquatic Federation vessels broke formation and began retreating toward their home waters. A squadron of Silicon Collective ships went into defensive mode, their crews deciding that protecting themselves was more important than protecting strangers. Within minutes, what had been a coordinated fleet of over 1,000 ships began dissolving into chaos. Ships scattered in different directions, abandoning their assigned positions. The carefully planned operation was falling apart, just when they needed unity the most. Admiral Dong-wook watched this disaster unfold from the bridge of his flagship and felt the weight of 50 billion lives pressing down on him. In that moment, he saw the future of galactic civilization slipping away. Not because they lacked the technology or the firepower to succeed, but because fear was stronger than hope. That's when Captain Minho made a decision that would be remembered for generations. "Admiral," he said calmly over the communication system, "I'm taking my ship directly toward Devourer 4. If I can't redirect it, maybe I can at least slow it down long enough for the Meridian evacuation to be completed." Everyone understood what he was saying. His ship, the New Horizon, was one of the smallest vessels in the fleet. Going directly toward a void devourer was suicide. But it might buy enough time to save billions of lives. "Captain, that's a suicide mission," Admiral Dong-wook replied. "Maybe," Minho said with characteristic human stubbornness. "But those are 50 billion innocent people down there. Someone has to try." Before anyone could stop him, Lieutenant Junho announced that he was leading a group of civilian transport ships, vessels that had no business being anywhere near a combat zone, directly into the danger area to help with evacuations. "Those civilian ships aren't armed or shielded," Commander Hai-won protested. "They'll be destroyed if they get too close." "Then we better make sure they don't get too close," Junho replied. "But we can't evacuate 50 billion people without every available ship." Admiral Dong-wook realized that his species' greatest strength wasn't their technology or their tactics. It was their absolute refusal to abandon others, even when doing so meant risking everything. In that moment of crisis, he made the most desperate decision of his career. "All ships, this is Admiral Dong-wook," he broadcast across every communication channel simultaneously. "I am authorizing the deployment of experimental quantum disruptors. These weapons are untested and could either save the Meridian cluster or tear apart local space-time. But we're going to use them anyway, because that's what you do when your friends are in danger." He paused, knowing that his next words would be translated into dozens of languages and heard by beings from across the galaxy. "I know some of you are scared. I know some of you want to retreat to safety. But I want you to remember something important. We don't abandon our friends, ever. That's not who we are. That's not who any of us are when we're at our best." The effect was immediate and profound. Ships that had been fleeing turned around and began returning to formation. Centaurian warriors straightened their shoulders and prepared for battle. Hive-speaker factory ships accelerated toward the danger zone. Even the cautious depth swimmers emerged from their defensive positions. The human spirit, that stubborn refusal to give up when others needed help, had become contagious. And in that moment, 50 billion lives hung in the balance while the galaxy decided whether hope was stronger than fear. The quantum disruptors worked, against all odds, against every calculation that said it was impossible, against the certainty that the galaxy was doomed. The experimental weapons that Admiral Dong-wook had authorized in desperation actually managed to create enough gravitational disturbance to push the two rogue void devourers back toward their intended feeding zones. It took 18 hours of continuous bombardment, and 3 more ships were lost in the process. But slowly, impossibly, all 7 of the massive creatures were guided away from populated systems and toward the artificial feeding grounds that had been prepared for them. When the last devourer finally settled into its designated zone and began consuming the prepared stellar matter instead of inhabited worlds, something extraordinary happened across the galaxy. On thousands of worlds, billions of beings who had been holding their breath for weeks finally exhaled. Celebration erupted spontaneously on planets that hadn't seen joy in months. Species that had been preparing for extinction suddenly found themselves planning for the future again. The galactic core was saved. 50 billion lives in the Meridian cluster were safe. But more than that, something fundamental had changed in how the galaxy saw itself. For the first time in recorded history, dozens of species had worked together not just to survive, but to protect each other. They had faced the impossible and won. 6 months later, Ambassador Jiwoo stood in the completely rebuilt council chambers on Nexus Prime. But this wasn't the same council that had dissolved in despair just a year before. The new assembly hall, was designed differently, with representatives seated in circles rather than hierarchical tiers. Species sat together based on their areas of expertise rather than their age or political power. The chamber itself seemed to hum with energy and purpose that had been missing for decades. The organization had been renamed too. The old Galactic Council, with its rigid protocols and ancient hierarchies, had been replaced by something new: the Galactic Cooperative. Every species, regardless of how long they had been spacefaring or how advanced their technology, had an equal voice in decisions that affected the galaxy's future. Most remarkably, humanity, despite being one of the youngest species in the galaxy, had been given a permanent leadership position, not because of their military power or their technological superiority, but because they had demonstrated something that the galaxy had forgotten: the courage to try when everyone else had given up. "Honored colleagues," Jiwoo began, addressing the packed assembly. Her voice carried easily through the chamber, no longer needing to struggle to be heard in a nearly empty room. 1 year ago, this galaxy had given up hope. Our greatest civilizations had retreated to their homeworlds to wait for the end. Our most advanced technologies had been deemed useless against the void devourers. Our oldest and wisest leaders had declared the situation hopeless. She paused, looking around at the faces of representatives from over 60 different species, more diversity than had ever been assembled in one place before. Today, we have not only survived, but we have learned something invaluable. We have discovered that no challenge is truly insurmountable when we face it together. The void devourers will return. Our scientists estimate that we have perhaps 50 to 70 years before the next major migration. But when they do come back, they will not find a galaxy of isolated, frightened civilizations waiting to die. They will find a united community that knows how to work together, how to share knowledge, and how to turn the impossible into the merely difficult. The applause that followed was unlike anything the old council chambers had ever heard. It wasn't the polite, formal acknowledgement of political speech, but genuine enthusiasm from beings who had found something they thought was lost forever: hope for the future. Admiral Dong-wook had been promoted to Supreme Commander of the new Cooperative Defense Fleet, a position that didn't exist in the old system. His job was to integrate the military technologies and tactics of dozens of species into unified defense strategies. It was challenging work, figuring out how to make Centaurian battle tactics work with hive-speaker manufacturing capabilities and depth swimmer sensor networks. But it was also incredibly rewarding. "We're not just building a bigger military," he explained to a gathering of new recruits from across the galaxy. "We're creating something that has never existed before. A defense force that combines the best ideas and technologies from every species in the galaxy. Our strength doesn't come from having the biggest ships or the most powerful weapons. Our strength comes from diversity, creativity, and the willingness to try new approaches when old ones don't work." Dr. Mi Young had been appointed to lead the New Cooperative Research Initiative, a massive scientific project dedicated to finding permanent solutions to the Void Devourer problem. Her team included the greatest minds from dozens of species, all working together to understand these mysterious creatures and develop better ways to manage them. "We're not just trying to redirect them anymore," she explained during a research briefing. "We're studying their biology, their behavior patterns, their life cycles. We want to understand where they come from, what they really are, and whether there might be ways to peacefully coexist with them rather than simply avoiding them." Captain Tae-hyun had taken on perhaps the most important job of all, training the next generation of multi-species commanders. His academy welcomed young beings from across the galaxy, teaching them not just military tactics, but how to work effectively with species very different from themselves. The old way of thinking was that each species should stick to what they knew best, he told his diverse class of cadets. Humans did human things, Centaurians did Centaurian things, and so on, but we've learned that the best solutions come when different perspectives work together. Your job isn't just to be good officers for your own species. Your job is to be good officers for the galaxy. As the assembly session concluded and representatives began to file out, Elder Voth of the Zephyrite Collective approached the human delegation. His crystalline form was glowing brighter than anyone had seen in years, pulsing with colors that indicated deep satisfaction and contentment. "Ambassador Ji Woo," he said, his wind chime voice filled with warmth. "I owe your species an apology. When you first came to us with your proposals, many of us dismissed you as naive newcomers who didn't understand the true scope of the crisis we faced." He paused, his crystal body shifting through beautiful patterns of light. "We were wrong. Your species has given us the greatest gift imaginable. You've reminded us that the word impossible is merely the beginning of possibility. You've shown us that sometimes the best solutions come not from those who know the most, but from those who refuse to accept that something can't be done." The galaxy had learned to hope again, and perhaps more importantly, it had learned that hope was not just a feeling but a choice. The choice to keep trying even when everything seemed hopeless, the choice to work together even when cooperation seemed impossible, and the choice to believe in tomorrow even when today looked dark. Big T. Void Devourers would return someday, but when they did, they would find a galaxy that was ready for them. Not because it had become more powerful, but because it had remembered how to be brave together.